Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Amy Brodigan, Alumni Relations Officer at Trinity Development and Alumni, and I'd like to welcome you to today's Inspiring Ideas at Trinity webinar. From Brexit to Biden to Brussels, Ireland and change in the EU, UK and USA. We're honoured and privileged to be joined by our guest speakers, Professor Gail McElroy, Tony Connolly and Rory Carroll. We've had huge interest in today's webinar with over 400 alumni registering from all over the world. The conversation today will last about 30 minutes and we'll leave plenty of time for audience questions. We encourage you to ask questions throughout the webinar using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. The webinar is also being recorded and will be available for later viewing on our YouTube channel. We're also using Zoom AI-generated closed captions for this webinar, and you can turn them on using the live transcript button at the bottom of your screen. So now I'd just like to introduce Gail, who will introduce the rest of our speakers today. Gail is a professor in political science and Dean of the Faculty of Arts, Humanities and Social Sciences at Trinity College Dublin. Her primary research interests are in the fields of legislative behaviour, party politics, electoral systems and European Union politics. Gail is also actively involved in the Irish National Election Study and the Irish Candidate Study, and recent published work in this area explores the continued underrepresentation of women in Irish politics and the dynamics of party competition in Dáil Éireann. She completed her primary degree in history and political science at Trinity in 1994, and she is also a graduate of the London School of Economics. Her PhD is from the University of Rochester. So now I'll hand over to you, Gail.
Thanks so much, Amy, and good afternoon, everyone. It's great to have so many of you join us here today for this politics panel. The politics panels are always very, very popular, and we have people from across the globe with us today, and we hope to hear from as many of you as possible. There's not a lot to recommend a global pandemic, but we've certainly been able to get more attendees at events such as this, and it's a really good opportunity to connect with our alumni across the world. Certainly we wouldn't have 200 people in a room on campus on a Wednesday at lunchtime during term time in normal circumstances. So wherever you are, you're most welcome today. We have two of Ireland's very finest journalists and proud Trinity alumni join us to discuss the state of the world and what we hope will be a very, very lively Q&A. So first up, let me introduce Rory Carroll, who's the Guardian's Ireland's correspondent. Rory joined The Guardian as a reporter in 1997, where he made his name initially covering the Northern Ireland peace talks. Over the course of the intervening 2.5 decades at The Guardian, his CV, it reads like a boy's own adventure with stints in Yemen, Serbia, Rome as Southern European correspondent for The Guardian. He's also reported from Pakistan and Afghanistan. He's been South African correspondent for The Guardian, Iraq correspondent, and latterly Latin American correspondent, and most recently, before he returned to Ireland in 2019, the US West Coast correspondent. Rory's had a truly remarkable career, breaking stories on war, human rights violations, and providing insights into underreported events from across the globe. And those of you who read his columns regularly, like I do, will know he is a really beautiful writer, capturing local flavor and providing insights in 800 words or less, typically. As it happens, Rory was a contemporary of mine in the 1990s here in Trinity, and I have several very, very distinct memories of him, but perhaps not for sharing before the watershed, or until we can be certain that the statute of limitation with the junior dean has elapsed. But I can say he was an unusually good writer, even as a 19-year-old. I distinctly recall sitting in the coffee dock in the arts block, reading one of his politics essays in the run-up to Scoil exams in 1992, and being truly blown away by the prose. So his success at one of the world's finest newspapers is no surprise to any of us who knew him way back then. So we're delighted to have you join us here today, Rory. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Gail, by the way, that you're a loss to public relations, really. You should quit the academia right now after that intro. So thank you very much for most of that.
Thanks, Rory. Our second guest today is also a proud Trinity alum and RTE's Man in Europe, Tony Connolly. Tony graduated from Trinity in 1987 and began his career writing for the Derry Journal and the Oxford Courier, which he followed with stints at the Irish Independent, the Evening Herald, Time and United Press International. He joined RTE back in 1994 as a television and radio reporter. And like Rory, he's ventured widely reporting from conflicts in Rwanda, Angola, Kosovo, Afghanistan, Iraq, Lebanon, Georgia, and Gaza. But he's best known to us for being European editor for RT News and Current Affairs, and he's been working the European desk since 2001. He is the ultimate Europe watcher and one of the most accomplished journalists on this beat, in demand with media outlets globally. He helps the people of Ireland navigate the intricacies of EU politics, institutions, and lawmaking almost daily. He's walked us through trade negotiations, the Northern Ireland Protocol, and his command of Brexit negotiations was, without a doubt, beyond compare. As a political scientist myself, I know from many political scientists in Europe and in North America, he is the font of insider information from within the Brussels Beltway. He's made it accessible to us all. I wasn't a contemporary of Tony's, but as an interesting aside, he was a contemporary of Luke O'Neill's, and they played in the band together when they met in college in the 1980s. And I believe, if I'm not mistaken, Tony, you still play together when you're in the same city. So we're delighted to have you both in the same room today and appreciate you taking time out of your very busy schedules for this event.
Thank you very much, Gail.
Yeah, thanks, Tony. So the format for today, it's really a questions and answers sessions with you, the audience, as the interviewees. I'm just a conduit for your queries, so please use the Q&A facility right from the get-go. I'll ask Rory and Tony 1 or 2 questions to get the ball rolling, and then it's over to you to get your burning questions on EU trade talks or the state of play in Northern Ireland answered. Just kind of on the questions, best to make the questions as concise as possible, and ideally starting with a who, what, when, where, or why, but you can slip in a how if you like as well. And it'd also be really nice, given I'm talking to a blank screen here, it'd be nice to have your name, graduation year, and degree, where you're joining us from, if relevant. It provides a little bit of color, and it will give other people in this webinar a chance to kind of connect. And you never know who's out there. We've already 228 attendees. And just keep it clean if possible. You may have very strong views on, for instance, the British Prime Minister, but perhaps this isn't the place to air them. So with that, let's get the show on the road. Rory, you left Ireland over 20 years ago and got your start at The Guardian reporting on the peace talks in the late 1990s, and you've done a lot of interesting travels and covered a lot of politics across the world in the intervening 2.5 decades, but you've kind of come full circle. For those of us who've been reading your Guardian pieces of late, you've been providing some excellent coverage of the riots and, the viable device that was unfortunately found under a car of a PSNI officer on Monday. So kind of with the kind of benefit of those 20 years, what have you found has changed, and what remains the same in Northern Ireland between 1998 and 2021?
Well, in some ways, I feel a bit like Rip Van Winkle in Northern Ireland, because in fact, I started there in the mid-90s with the Irish News. That was my first job in journalism, that Belfast daily paper for 2 years there. And that was the tail end of the Troubles. And when the peace process was stepping up into high gear, Good Friday Agreement was around the corner. And it was also the time of Drumcree, the protests, a lot of tensions. And so now when I've come back, it's actually like 25 years since then. I mean, on one level, the changes are striking. I mean, you go to Belfast now and you just see how, I mean, the inner part of the city is so wealthy and, feels sophisticated. And so it's a different place in many ways. But these riots, when I was up the last 2 weeks covering them, it really was just like same old, same old. It just felt like taking almost as if not many things really had changed. Because when you see, and I spoke to these, especially kind of loyalist kids, and asking them, why are you out throwing petrol bombs and rocks? And, they give you a mix of reasons. It was the Irish sea border would be one, the policing over that Bobby Storey Sinn Féin funeral, and then they threw in a whole bunch of micro issues of that their cousin had been lifted for drug dealing down the street, whereas over in the nationalist housing estate, they can deal as many drugs as they want. And there's this whole kind of melange of things, and the connecting thread was grievance and a sense that the loyalism and the unionist community was losing in a battle, in a binary kind of struggle with nationalism. And so they felt that, that was maybe inchoate, but very sincerely felt. And that was profoundly dispiriting. I was just there before they threw the petrol bomb on the bus, and you just think, God, really? And then you hear the sectarian chants and the abuse, and then you go over onto the Springfield roadside, and it was basically mirror images. The kids there looked like the same. I mean, they all look like a bad advert for North Face fleeces. I mean, they're all wearing these dark fleeces, and they look and sound the same, and yet those kind of old hatreds were being spouted again. And yeah, it was actually really depressing. I came back quite saddened by it, and yeah, and I've got a feeling we're going to be seeing a lot more of that.
Do you think, Rory, that it's mostly about unresolved issues from the past, or is the Brexit protocol, is it that oil on the flames, or is it mostly about the recent secession from the EU of the UK?
It's a whole bunch of things. It's like a cauldron of grievance, socioeconomic things, lack of employment opportunities, and again, the sense zero sum, their perception that they are suffering more than Catholics, which actually isn't quite backed up by the statistics. So certainly Brexit, has been hosed combustible fuel onto these grievances, and that's why it's difficult to be optimistic about what's going to be happening, certainly for this coming marching season this summer.
Thanks, Rory. On that same topic, Tony, you've been covering the talks between David Frost and Maris Sefcovic, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. Have the recent riots in Northern Ireland had any impact on those negotiations around the protocol?
I think they have in some way, Gail. First of all, the rioting kicked off over Easter weekend and Easter weekend. A lot of officials and diplomats were away from Brussels, so it didn't have an immediate response. But I'm actually amazed at how well tuned in Europeans are to what's happening in Northern Ireland. When you talk to officials and diplomats here in Brussels and in other capitals, they are quite conditioned to the complexities of the peace process and I suppose the tribal nature of things. I mean, in some ways that's not surprising because we've been at this for 6 years now, since the referendum happened in 2016 and even before it happened, the Irish issue was raised, and within a couple of months of the referendum result, the Irish government was, diplomats from the Department of Foreign Affairs were out there in capitals and in Brussels circulating non-papers, discussion papers on this kind of pedagogical exercise to inform people about the Irish.
Oh, I think has Tony broken up?
Throwing a wedge. I'm back. Sorry. Throwing a wedge on the land border between North and South, and probably hundreds, if not thousands, of officials from across the EU were dragged through Irish history for 5 years during the Brexit negotiations. I mean, these negotiations were extremely detailed in terms of the niceties and the kind of granular nature of the single market and the customs union, but they also touched on identity. They touched on things like the volume of milk that crosses the border, north and south. Like lambs go south for slaughter, pigs go north for slaughter. And you'd be amazed at how attuned European diplomats who, spend their winters skiing in fancy resorts and their summers in Lake Garda, had to appraise themselves of all of this stuff, because they would have to endorse whatever treaty was agreed. They had to know exactly what was in the protocol. There have been very precise structures. There's a thing called the Working Party, which is all the Brexit coordinators from each member state, and they would meet regularly and get briefings from the European Commission, which in turn had a big task force of very bright, very well-educated people who would be, again, dragging themselves through the minutiae of the Northern Ireland economy, the supply chain model, the history with the UK. So when I was talking to people during the riots, they were saying, yeah, well, of course, this reminds us that this is a very real problem in Northern Ireland. It's kind of sobering, but at the same time, they'd say, yeah, well, of course, there's the East Antrim UDA Brigade who've had their drug dealing model broken up by the PSNI, and of course, they're annoyed. And it's social deprivation, it's recreational rioting, it's boredom, and so on. I don't think it has really moved the dial that much in terms of what is going to happen to the protocol. I mean, it's always worth remembering that Maros Šefčovič, as you mentioned there, he's the guy who does the deal with David Frost with his team, and he's again, up to his knees in the detail. But member states also have to give their consent to this, and the European Parliament, and they are not going to accept shortcuts simply because people are rioting in Belfast. They want to make sure that the single market is protected. They want to make sure that Britain complies with its international obligations through the protocol, and they're watching this closely. But having said all that, they are absolutely open to finding whatever flexibilities there are within the framework of the protocol. And you're going to have dozens of officials in DG Sante, which is the Commission's Food Safety and Animal Health division, poring over the regulations to see where they can push the envelope here and there to make a difference, to make the protocol work a bit more effectively.
Great, thanks. And the questions are flooding in here from the audience, and there's quite a few on the future. So this is speculation, so we won't hold you to it, although it is being preserved for posterity. Nuala Bannon, who's a PhD in chemistry in 1984, one for both of you. Looking ahead 10, 15 years, how do you see Scotland, Brexit, and maybe Northern Ireland itself? Do you see Scotland, we have the elections coming up in May, early May, if the Scottish National Party, I guess, gain a majority, does that have ramifications for the State of the Union in the UK? Also, we had polls out today, reported, actually two sets of polls, if I'm not mistaken, BBC Northern Ireland Spotlight, demonstrating that there isn't a majority yet for unity in Northern Ireland. And that in the Republic Red Sea poll, if I'm not mistaken, I know you've reported on it, Tony, that a majority of people don't envisage unity of Ireland in the next 10 years, although the Spotlight polls suggested that a majority were in favour of it. So how do you see it playing out in the kind of short to medium term in Northern Ireland in terms of unification, secession, Scotland, all of those big questions? Either of you.
Okay, do you want to go ahead there, Roy?
Okay, sure, I'll jump off. Well, of course, the answer is no one has a clue, and that's why the political atmosphere is so febrile. I mean, these polls, the opinion polls, fluctuate. I mean, what's interesting about this one is that the Lucid poll in Northern Ireland is usually shows, if it has a bias, it's more towards showing higher preferences for a United Ireland. And so the fact that this one has a kind of a lower preference for United Ireland could knock briefly some of the wind out of the sails of Sinn Féin's attempts. But these polls, as I say, they bubble up and down, and they'll change. The more meaningful polls will be, of course, the election next month, and to see what happens in Scotland, because that for sure will have a big ramification on Northern Ireland. I mean, when I was up in Newtonabbey and Carrickfergus covering the riots 2 weeks ago, from Carrickfergus you can actually see Scotland, and it is striking how often loyalists will kind of allude to Scotland or just feel it as their kind of cultural home, because it's a lonely place to be, actually, culturally speaking, if you're a Northern Ireland loyalist. And Scotland is perhaps the only place they feel that there's a kind of a connection there. And if Scotland leaves the Union, I mean, they really are in trouble. I mean, they already have, frankly, an inferiority complex about lots of things, and they feel insecure about so many things. So if Scotland goes, that for sure will have a massive impact on events in Northern Ireland. And the other, of course, most meaningful poll will be the next elections in Northern Ireland and the South, because it's extremely possible that we're going to have a Sinn Féin-led government in the north and one here in the south. I mean, if and when that happens, I mean, one can only start trying to imagine how that's going to change the atmosphere and the pressure that could then bring to bear on the British government, whomever may be in power then, to actually to call a referendum and so on. So, and the fact that these are all up in the air, I mean, no one knows really what's gonna happen, is frankly one of the reasons why we're seeing petrol bombs now, because you know, people are feeling very, very nervous.
Thanks, Tony.
Yeah, I would agree with Rory on a lot of that. I mean, I haven't reported on Scottish independence, but I did visit Peterhead just after the referendum to talk to fishermen there about the common fisheries policy and so on. But clearly, yeah, I mean, if there is an independence vote in Scotland, then that diminishes the union, and that takes away a lot of the rationale of unionists. And again, as Rory says, you know, it creates this feeling of being marooned. And I think the rise of Sinn Féin is fascinating to watch as a political spectacle. I mean, I've just been listening to a really compelling podcast on the Northern Bank robbery and by the BBC by Glenn Patterson, and the questions that it raises about where all that money went, and you know, did it help to fund Sinn Féin's political rise? You know, obviously no proof was given, but this was obviously the speculation around that. I mean, I think what the Irish government is doing regarding a united Ireland is admirable. I mean, we know the mistake of Brexit, where a sort of ideologically charged cohort of people just raced into a referendum without thinking through the consequences, especially for Northern Ireland. And nobody really wants to repeat that on the island of Ireland. So I think this idea of a shared island initiative that Micheál Martin is spearheading as Taoiseach is a very good idea, because if you see the demographic changes in Northern Ireland and the political changes, you are getting the emergence of this middle ground of younger voters who might be attracted to the Green Party or the Alliance Party, who don't identify as nationalist or unionist, whose vote in any border poll could be decisive, and who may want to judge a united Ireland on its merits economically and in terms of health coverage, rather than just being driven by the identity impulse of being nationalist or unionist. You know, they'll judge it on its merits. And I think the more you prepare the ground for a potential united Ireland that would deal with health differentials across the border, that would deal with social welfare, with pension rights, to try and say, well, if we are going to have a poll in 10 or 15 years' time, let's create the kind of groundwork so that if there is a united Ireland, it is kind of as seamless as possible, and it might be able to prepare some of the identity questions for unionists as well. I mean, Neil Richmond, TD, has talked a lot about this, the idea that just because there's a united Ireland doesn't mean you lose your British identity or your unionist identity. I mean, most unionists would say, not true. I mean, by definition, you can't be a unionist in a united Ireland. But I mean, who knows? Like, the Good Friday Agreement is remarkable for its ability before Brexit to create a new kind of more ambiguous set of allegiances, so you could be Irish or Northern Irish or British or all three. So who knows what might be on the menu, say in 10 or 15 years. But I mean, I think that poll this morning, the Red Sea poll, was very interesting. People disagree largely with the view that there will be a united Ireland in the European Union in 10 years' time. It doesn't mean they don't want a united Ireland. It just means they don't think it's going to happen. And I suspect that that's probably true. Although, again, as Rory says, who knows what will happen if you have Sinn Féin in the south and in the north in power. I mean, that could be a whole new ballgame.
Great, thank you. And now two related questions, kind of still on Northern Ireland, but kind of bringing in the change of administration in the United States. So from David Clinch, 1987, good morning from America. I'm wondering if Rory and Tony have an opinion on whether the Biden administration should appoint a special envoy to Northern Ireland. And also from, Brian McCall, Dr. Brian Cole, how do you envisage the future intervention of the USA Biden administration working out in relation to the Good Friday Agreement? So thinking about that and thinking about, even taking it one step further, how has the change of administration in the United States played out among the various communities, either in Northern Ireland or among the, the political leaders in Brussels or even in London? If you'd like to comment on that, Rory.
I think not much impact, at least on a profound level. And about the Northern Ireland envoy, I'm not convinced there's much of a need or value in having a Northern Ireland envoy. Like, what would he or she do really at this point? I mean, Mick Mulvaney, who was appointed by Trump to that role, of course, COVID hobbled that, but it's unclear to me what he could bring to the table, and likewise any appointee by Biden. And you would hope, so many decades down the road from the Good Friday Agreement, that Northern Ireland should be able to, and the British and Irish governments, be able to walk, and handle this themselves. It'd be a bit of an indictment if we felt we needed some outside arbitrator to come in and hold hands again. But I mean, one immediate impact so far off the Biden administration is just the tone, the fact that Biden is a friend of Ireland. His Irish roots really are important to him. It's not just blarney from him. And so I think for the more insecure unionists, this is yet more bad news, because it can make them feel even lonelier. The fact that the pan-nationalist front, inverted commas, has yet now a new ally in the White House. So I think rhetorically it has had an impact, but beyond that, in terms of the granular machinations of politics in Northern Ireland, so far I don't see any big change.
Great. And in Brussels, Tony, any impact?
Yeah, just to pick up on Rory's point, you could argue that there's no need for a Northern Ireland envoy because they have one in the White House already. It's striking how prominently Joe Biden has asserted his Irishness and how quickly that was brought to bear on the tensions between Britain and the EU over the protocol and the application of the protocol. And I think that it was clear last autumn that the UK government had one eye over its shoulder on how any of their moves on the protocol would go down in the White House. And I think that will be the case for a while. Just in general terms, absolutely no doubt that the EU is very relieved that Trump is gone and that Biden is there, a committed multilateralist, and they will be heartened by his very swift embrace of the Paris climate agreement and the fact that he has brought America back into the fold on climate change. But I think at the same time Europe has been looking at America with a clear eye in recent years, and despite the Trump administration's disdain for multilateralism and hostility to the European project, people see America as not necessarily being that shining city on a hill anymore, simply because of the problems America has had at home and abroad over the past 30 years. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, the handling of domestic crises like Hurricane Katrina, the race tensions and so on. I think Europe is looking to its own backyard and its own resources a lot more. We hear a lot of talk now about open strategic autonomy as a new guiding principle for the European Union, which could mean anything really to whoever is listening. But this idea that Europe can't depend on America for its unswerving support in an international context. That was obviously clearly true during the Trump years, but I think they feel that it's not just going to be business as usual with Biden. That Europe has to figure out its posture with China, its posture with Russia. We hear a lot of talk about supply chains, especially around the pandemic and the production of vaccines. So this is still an unsettling time for the European Union, and it isn't simply just going to be put right by the arrival of Joe Biden.
That neatly segues into a question from John O'Hagan, who I'm sure is known to almost every attendee in the room for his decades of teaching the economy of Ireland. And he also says, I taught Rory in college. I'm sure you can remember that, Rory. And listen to the excellent Tony Connolly on All Matters EU. Question, do either of them hold out much hope for change from the forthcoming conference on the future of the EU? And to put even kind of an economics kind of spin on that, like what's on the agenda for the EU or Britain in the coming 3, 5, 10 years? And will everything be dominated by kind of a macroeconomic crisis? But so several questions in there, Tony. Conference of Europe first, perhaps.
Yeah, so the Conference on the Future of Europe was the brainchild of Emmanuel Macron, and it was seen as a response, I think at the time, to all of the crises that Europe had been dealing with for 10 years. The financial crisis, the refugee crisis, terrorism, then Brexit, climate, China, you name it. And I think Macron wanted a genuine sort of grassroots input into this. But then, first of all, the Conference on the Future of Europe got sidelined by the pandemic. And then it got into this awful Brussels structural turf war about who would run it and who would be in charge and how it would actually operate. And there was some very unseemly kind of turf war going on. And they've created this political level and an executive level, which looks very unwieldy. It's going to be run by the three main institutions, and then member states will have a role in the European Parliament. But they have set up this multilingual digital platform to try and genuinely invite views from around Europe. I mean, when I put a story out on this on Twitter the other day, inevitably people are saying, yeah, they'll invite people to give their views and then promptly ignore them. But it looks like they're trying at least to set up the ability for people, for groups, for stakeholders, for civil society to register their views either in writing or by video, and then there will be citizens panels that will be connected to to the conference plenary sessions. And of course, there'll be a lot of activity at national and regional political level as well. It's hard to see where it's going to land. At the moment, the fault line is between those countries who want treaty change, real meaningful change at EU level, meaningful reform, or those countries who, like Ireland, would rather not have a treaty change because it means a referendum, most likely. And who wants those? So that's really where the fault line is at the moment. How deep will this reform be? But it's certainly. I mean, it's funny. I covered an earlier conference on the future of Europe way back in the early 2000s under Giscard d'Estaing, and at the time when they produced the glittering new EU constitution, they said this is going to be Europe's constitutional position will be settled for 50 years, and then suddenly the French came along and rejected it in a referendum, and the Dutch did as well. But I think it's no harm that Europe is being constantly refreshed with ideas and reform. But it is, let's just count the things that have really blindsided Europe in recent years: the financial crash, the refugee crisis, security, terrorism, Brexit, the pandemic. And while people still adhere to this idea that it's only when there's a crisis that Europe actually moves forward and stabilizes and strengthens itself, you can't rely on that sort of recipe forever. So I think the big issues that Europe has to tackle, they need to be very mindful of how they do it, and that it doesn't just become showboating by big member states like France, who are obviously going to have their presidency when this conference comes to a close.
Very good. And Rory, obviously the UK is not participating in this conference, but the Conservatives have a healthy majority. The next general election in the UK is probably not till May 24. Do you think there are any big issues, big ticket items that the Tories will tackle in the coming years before that election kind of is on their doorstep?
Well, I mean, the future of the UK, of course, will be high up there. And it will be fascinating just to watch as political theatre how Boris Johnson handles it. I watched him, I was at the DUP party conference in 2018 when he came over before he was Prime Minister and said that, of course, he could never permit a border down the Irish Sea. And, he's a class act when you see him up close. I mean, he is charismatic, and it's also very easy to underestimate him, because he plays the buffoon, and clearly he seems perpetually kind of short-termist in terms of he might be good on tactics, but you have to wonder, to what extent is there a bigger sense of strategy there. But his political hero is Winston Churchill, and if for no other reason, Boris Johnson will not want to be the Prime Minister that is seen to have lost Scotland or lost Northern Ireland, even if his unionism is actually quite skin deep. So I think he'll do everything he can to try to avoid Scotland or Northern Ireland going their own way. And how Europe will fit into this, I mean, who possibly knows? But I think he may well might be useful for him to pick battles, pick fights with the Commission, which will always play well with his own base. So I can imagine we're going to be, see some kind of combustible battles between Boris Johnson's government and the Commission.
Great, thanks. I think you've answered CJ Walsh's question. After Boris Johnson's recent Northern Ireland TV interview, can he be trusted by anybody on anything? But we'll move on to the next one, because I did say we weren't to take his name in vain. A nice question from Rosie Allenby, who's a recent graduate, 2019, in Irish and French, and this is one for you, Tony, mostly. How has Brexit impacted how Ireland is perceived in the EU? And are we seen as more or less an important actor now that the UK has left? And I suppose I'd add to that, who are our most likely allies? We've lost kind of a big ally in negotiations in the comitology process, in the Commission. Are we making friends with the Dutch and the Scandinavians, or how focused are we?
Yeah, well, we've that's a great question. I mean, we have sort of Ireland has self-consciously gone out to make friends, because of course our closest ally on a lot of issues was Britain, as you know. I mean, we're very close to France on agriculture, fisheries as well, although there's been a bit of sort of jostling over how much both countries will get out of the Brexit adjustment fund that was set up, this €5 billion fund that was set up. I mean, Ireland has always been perceived as at times a poster boy for European integration. I mean, the storied development of Ireland going hand in hand with access to the EU in the early 70s, and Ireland becoming an open, successful economy. But then we have this habit of blotting our copybook really spectacularly at times, with the Anglo-Irish Bank and property bubble. But generally, certainly when the British referendum happened, the Brexit referendum happened, there was a view in Brussels and in member states that Ireland needed to be protected, because Ireland had taken one for the team with the bailout, and European banks were protected. Ireland had suffered immensely, not as badly as Greece, and it obviously recovered a lot quicker than Greece, but Ireland did suffer very badly in the bailout times, and there was a view that Ireland was a committed European. And I mean, the solidarity principle does run fairly deep in the European Union. I think Ireland would have been protected anyway, but it was seen as important to try and resolve the Irish problem during the Brexit negotiations. And I mean, the solidarity that was there for Ireland, and the unity certainly of purpose by other member states in accepting. I mean, the Irish government put forward its analysis of how Brexit would damage the peace process, and that analysis was accepted hook, line, and sinker by the Commission and by other member states. I mean, I can think of only one country, and that was Poland, who raised any queries or possible red flags over the protocol, and that was once or twice. And I'm told that Simon Coveney nearly had to be separated from the Polish foreign minister during one Foreign Affairs Council after the Polish foreign minister had said, we have to choose between a successful trade agreement or Ireland, and we can't be beholden to the Irish question. Nowadays, Ireland is seen as an important. I mean, this is interesting. After a recent summit, a group of journalists got a private briefing from Charles Michel, the president of the council. Now, this was all background, so it shouldn't really go beyond these walls. But I mean, he said that he had a very important relationship with the Taoiseach, because the Taoiseach was kind of, to him, an interpreter of the British mind, an interpreter of the British tabloid mentality as well, which was a kind of a new factor for Charles Michel. But also he said that the closeness between Ireland and Washington was very important for him as well, to get that kind of channel of insight and intelligence, what was useful. So I think Ireland has a somewhat kind of privileged or charmed place in the European Union as a result of Brexit, and currently as a result of the Biden administration.
Well, that's encouraging. Thank you. Here's a question for you, Rory, building on your 7 years in the US. And this is from Declan Boland. The relationship between the US and the UK and Ireland has never been equal. The UK's is commercial and historical, while Ireland's has been more cultural and quaint. The view of Declan is that the Biden is a pragmatist and nothing much will change. Do you agree?
In terms of, perhaps, yes, actually, I do agree, because when it comes to, for example, things like corporate tax, I think Biden will be a supreme pragmatist, and I think his affinity for Ireland won't stop him or the administration doing what they want to do on taxes. A warm glow for the old sod is not going to deter them for doing whatever it is that they eventually choose to do on that. So, in that sense, there will be, I think, a continuity. And it's, I think, more interestingly, actually, for Biden will be what he does kind of domestically, I think, because, will he be able to kind of reboot the United States in a way that we've seen? And I think, I mean, there's two interesting things. One is, of course, the change of tone, vocabulary, the fact that there's now a sense of, I don't know, I'd say kind of normality, even a sense of civility has rhetorically returned to Washington, and that has to be welcome. The stimulus spending is huge, and so I think Biden may well turn out to be a very consequential president, even if he is just a one-term president. To what extent this will have enduring effects in the US, though, is another one that I'm unsure about, because the problems in the US that, and here we could, talk about policing, and are so, there's been an unraveling in the US of kind of institutions, you could argue values, over the past generation, even pre-Trump, and Trump, is arguably a symptomatic of this sense of unmooring of the US, and the fact that the middle class dream is becoming seems to be becoming unobtainable for people of white and black, and those problems are so deeply entrenched, so complex. It's really difficult to see how any one-term president could have a long-term impact on those. I mean, he might, but I'm a bit pessimistic about that. Partly because in Los Angeles, it was astonishing and just really awful over the 6 years there, which I loved. I loved California, but the inequality and manifested in homelessness. There were tent cities that just mushroomed across Los Angeles, one of the wealthiest cities in the world. And you saw scenes of third world squalor multiplying during my 6 years there. I mean, scenes of deprivation that I never hardly, would seldom see in Africa or Latin America. And that's only got worse since I left in the past 3 years. So, and in addition to that, in every action in the US will have its own reaction. So there will be a pendulum swing eventually against the stimulus, against if there is going to be meaningful reform of the police. At some point, the pendulum will go back the other way towards a law and order agenda, be it through a Democrat or Republican. So, I think Biden's going to be a big deal, but I still don't think he's going to have really change the US for good or for ill. So I wasn't quite an answer to the question, but that's my spiel.
But some very interesting points there. And you did actually touch on an issue that Anya Kennedy has raised. It's another Biden question. Over the last few decades, US firms have used Ireland's tax system to reduce their global tax, and Ireland has benefited greatly. Could either of you talk a little about how Biden's tax plan might impact US investment in Ireland? You can expand it out, to mean a kind of a European level tax rate. How would this affect Ireland? We don't need you to explain the intricacies of the double Irish. I'm not sure any of us really fully understand it. But is it possible that this will impact US investment in Ireland? Is it realistic, or is he playing to a domestic audience? And what are the similar plans in Europe, Tony?
Yeah, I mean, I think it does have the potential to affect Ireland's tax rate, perhaps in a more direct way than any legislation at the EU level. I mean, actually in about 15 minutes time, there's another webinar that I'll be listening in on, which will be Pascal Donoghue, the finance minister, and the OECD people on taxation on this very subject. I mean, he's obviously as finance minister, but also Eurozone president, Eurogroup president. I mean, it is a very detailed area, and just in general terms, the Irish government, when people criticize the tax arrangements in Ireland, and when we've had the very sort of raw cases of Apple and so on, the Irish government's view is that yes, there has to be tax reform, but it has to be done at global level. There's no point in Europe doing it itself, and Ireland still jealously guards its national veto on taxation. And that Red C poll this morning again showed that a growing majority of Irish people want to make sure that veto is untouched, even at the expense of greater economic integration in the Eurozone. I mean, it's obviously going to be a big issue in the coming months, and it will come up in the Conference on the Future of Europe. For now, there is not a majority in favour of changing the veto at EU level, and I think the Irish government is extremely relieved at that. But I think as well, Pascal Donoghue has signalled that he expects some kind of changes that will come at international level as a result of the OECD BEPS process. But yeah, that's probably my best shot at it. The sort of intricacies of the Biden tax reform, I'm not entirely au fait with, but that's sort of a slightly EU lens on things.
Great, thank you. This has been a really wide-ranging discussion, and the politics of the Republic have been dominated by Brexit since 2016. I'm often interested when, even from 2018, 2019 in Europe, it seemed to me that a lot of European officials had moved on. It was happening, they would deal with it, and they were bored with it, particularly the French. I suppose, we've seen it almost entirely as a negative can you, but it's happened and we need to put a positive spin on it. What are the benefits for the Republic from Brexit, if any, or Northern Ireland, which is a harder case to make, I think, Rory?
Well, I mean, in some senses, there are obvious benefits now. So, once the sea links between Ireland and the European mainland are fully developed, and Ireland doesn't need to rely on the land bridge of the UK, then you can see Ireland filling gaps that are left behind by British manufacturers. And there's a kind of a double-edged sort of benefit there, or virtue there, because there are a lot of European firms who are pulling back from Britain because of the complexity of Brexit and the new controls and obligations, and who perhaps don't need, perhaps have other markets to serve within the single market. And I'm told by Enterprise Ireland that there are opportunities opening up for Irish companies to step in there as well. So you've got this sort of funny, possible ironic double advantage for Ireland, filling in the gaps left by British companies retreating from the EU, and filling in the gaps left by European companies retreating from Britain. That might be oversimplifying it, but that is certainly something that Enterprise Ireland has noticed. But you'd have to say there are a lot of companies in the agri-food sector who are really going to suffer as a result of Brexit in terms of serving the UK market, especially when the UK brings in the full range of controls for foodstuffs and animal health, which they have delayed, and which they keep delaying because I don't think they're ready, frankly.
Rory, any positives for either the Republic or the North from Brexit that you'd like to highlight?
Yeah, this one, I don't know, the only one that really occurs right now would be that if we could, become, as Tony alluded to, sort of the Brit whisperers for Brussels, and that if we are our alleged kind of cultural affinity with them could be perceived in Brussels as a way that we could become a bridge, in a sense, to London, then that would be good.
I'm surprised neither of you have mentioned the major benefit. Trinity has now become the leading English-speaking university in the European Union, with all due respect to the University of Valletta. And with that in mind, and we're coming towards a close, perhaps you'd like to, just kind of finish up with a reflection on what your Trinity education did for you and how it led you to these successful, incredible careers as two of the world's leading journalists.
God.
That's inflation right there. Lead world leading journalist, Tony. It's official. Okay. Well, I can just jump in and say, I mean, I was actually reflecting on this morning. For me, one thing that really endures, and I will always cherish Trinity for this, is that it was such a melting pot of students from all over Ireland, but especially from the north. And I'm from Dublin. And it's not often I would have met, and interacted with Northerners. And I remember in the first year in Freshers Week, they had so many Northern Ireland accents, and they were like these exotic creatures from, I relatives up the north. I would go there, but I didn't really know it. And the fact that then suddenly these were peers and friends, and then after a while, even stopped even noticing the accents, and it was all just Irish, British, whatever. It was all this kind of genuine happy mix. And in my naivete, I thought, this was just like a vision of the future in a way, or the way things could be and would be. And what then struck me is then coming back here to Ireland 2 years ago, after a quarter century away, was that huge changes. I mean, demographically, socially in Ireland, and yet the north of Ireland and the south of Ireland still feel so different to each other. There's it seems to me very little kind of organic kind of interactions between them. I mean, in south of Ireland, you hardly ever, I've never heard anybody listening to BBC Radio Ulster, or where would you buy the Belfast Telegraph or the Irish News in a news station here? You have to really go hunting for it. And likewise in Belfast, you just don't. People hardly listen to RTE, and it just still feels like two completely different countries. And there's and that's sad, and I'm surprised that given that there have been so many other changes, we've had the Good Friday Agreement, and yeah, it still feels, you know, Irish people in Dublin might be very happy to go off to Valletta for a holiday, but they wouldn't dream really, or why would you go to Belfast? When was the last time you were there? But why would I go? You know, it's, and vice versa. Like when I was speaking to these loyalist kids last week, asking them about Dublin, like had they ever been here or even across the border, and they looked at me, you know, horrified. Like, why would you go there? I mean, they'd beat you up. They would, you know, the south of Ireland was like a malign alien entity. And that was really sad, you know, and that just cast a warm glow over my memories of Trinity and that melting pot ambience. And I just wish it would somehow seep out across the rest of the island.
Thanks, Rory. Tony?
Yeah, no, so it's very interesting to hear Rory's perception, because I'm from Derry originally, so I was one of those exotic creatures, you know, walking across Front Square in 1983. I mean, for me, like, because my brother Stephen had gone to Trinity, and then, you know, I went to Trinity in 1983, you know, and spent 4 years of the 80s there, which was a really dreadful time in the Troubles. And to me, going to Dublin was just an escape from all that sort of narrow-minded, sectarian, sort of buttoned-down, you know, culturally restricted sort of environment of Northern Ireland at that time. And Trinity was just awash with new people, and you know, the close friends I made in my first year were from actually Scotland, England, Canada, America. Like, I went to Trinity Hall, so of course it's just this one great melting pot, as Rory says. Right there, you make sort of 50 friends in a day. I remember one friend from that year, Saoirse McClory, was, I think her father made James Bond films or something. You know, this was, and then there's another girl in Trinity who was from the Bahamas. You know, I couldn't conceive of this level of sort of the exotic. I studied Trinity in English under Nicholas Green and Brendan Kennelly, Terence Brown. I studied Irish as well with Terence McCaughey. And, you know, I was really drawn to Anglo-Irish literature, and I think partly because of my background and sort of having a nationalist background in Derry, and being drawn to the roots of Irish nationalism, and, you know, feeling that literature and language was a pathway out, or a pathway into something. And I think, even though, you know, when I went to Trinity, I had sort of this idea that I'd be a journalist or some kind of writer at the end of it all. You know, I don't think I opened a single newspaper in my 4 years in Trinity, and I had to sort of learn the hard way. You know, I didn't get into some of the journalism courses in Dublin at that time. I had to go to London. But then I did, you know, when I did get into journalism, I think that the tools that I had sort of acquired as an English student, you know, questioning authority, questioning the established view, and then having this real love for Anglo-Irish literature, also American drama as well. You know, I was able to use my skills as a writer, I think, to make a bit of a mark as a journalist. And I think, you know, at a certain point, I was a freelance feature writer for The Independent, and I could then feel like I could write as well as being a journalist, and that got me a bit of a profile, and then that helped me get into RTE, and, you know, voila.
Rest is history. Thanks so much to you both for sharing those personal thoughts about how formative your undergraduate years were here in Trinity. And all that remains is for me to thank both Rory and Tony for sharing their time and thoughts with us today. I really enjoyed this session and learned a lot. And a big thanks to our alumni from across the world also, to your passion for the politics of Ireland and Europe. Just sorry we couldn't get to all of your questions. And with that, hope you stay in touch with us. And I'm going to pass over to Amy. Amy, thank you.
Thanks, guys. That was absolutely fantastic. Just so insightful and interesting. And just on behalf of all our alumni, I'd like to say a very sincere thanks to Gail for being a wonderful MC today. And thanks again to Tony and Rory for so generously giving us their time today. I'd also like to thank my colleagues, Siobhan Brady and Aoife Brady, who helped put this webinar together. and to the audience for all those great questions. If you'd like some more information on today's topics, you can check out some links there at the bottom of the screen for the Department of Political Science at Trinity, the Guardian website, also RTE's Brexit Republic podcast, and we've included the Twitter links for our speakers if you'd like to follow them on Twitter. If you've any questions about the series in general, you can email alumni@tcd.ie. And just to let you know, the next webinar in the series will be on Wednesday, the 5th of May, titled Arts, Humanities and Technology, Snapshots from the Trinity Longroom Hub, with guest speakers Chris Morash, inaugural Seamus Heaney Professor of Irish Writing, Jennifer Edmond, Associate Professor of Digital Humanities at Trinity, and Jennifer O'Meara, Assistant Professor in Film Studies in the School of Creative Arts. And they will be discussing how arts and humanities scholars are embedding technology in their teaching and research practices and integrating technology in new ways. And also just a reminder that the next webinar in our Future City series will focus on London, and that'll be on the April the 28th, with guest speakers Dr. Brian Caulfield, Associate Professor in the Department of Civil, Structural and Environmental Engineering at Trinity, Dr. Sarah Pritchard, UK Managing Director and Partner at Bureau Happold Engineering, and Vincent Keaveney, Senior Alderman, City of London and Partner at DLA Piper. So those are two great webinars coming up. And once